Hello, everyone. Welcome to the plenary that is being organized by the Social Justice Cluster of the AEPF. I am Meena Menon. I am a housing and labor rights activist, co-convener of the AEPF Social Justice Cluster, and I am also working president of the Working People's Charter, which is a national network for informal sector in India. So to introduce the theme for this plenary, as a social justice cluster, we have been exploring the need for fulfillment of the basic conditions of life for all and how this can be achieved. We have a global charter on social protection, which is the basis of our ongoing campaign, which I will share with you in the chat in a bit. We have been discussing and trying to build a common understanding on what constitutes universal and comprehensive social protection and how to achieve it. And an important part of that discourse is the role of income. During the COVID lockdowns, most people at the bottom of the ladder, the worst affected being workers without security of employment, were deprived of their income. And because their access to social needs like food, housing, medical support were to a large extent dependent on an income, they and their families were left homeless and hungry. We have been saying that access to basic needs need not be unaffordable. If public expenditures are better planned, with people as priority, universal and affordable social protection is possible. There are financial resources available if there is political will. For instance, through wealth taxation, debt solutions, shutting down tax havens, lowering military expenditures, to name a few. So we have organized this discussion to hear from experts and practitioners in the field and to enrich and refine this idea on how to make sure that no one is deprived of the basic conditions of life. We will start with two keynote speakers on this issue. I will introduce them just before they speak. Both will have 15 minutes each, and we will signal you at 14 minutes. So far as the participants are concerned, please ask your questions, address the speaker concerned, and we will pass that on to the speakers, and the speakers can also read it in the chat. Please put down and also you're welcome to introduce yourself in the chat to say that you're there and who you are. So we will start now with Isabel Ortiz. I will introduce her. She is director of the Global Social Justice Program at Joseph Stiglitz Initiative for Policy Dialogue based at Columbia University. In 2013 to 2019, she was director of the Social Protection Department at the United Nations ILO, the International Labour Organization, and she is the author of Austerity Alert. Isabel.
Thank you very much, Meena, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I'm going to present precisely on this austerity alert, and the key message, however, is that this is not necessary, and actually there are financing resources for all the development needs we want to do, from social protection to any other. Now, let me share the screen because I have limited time. Here. Okay. So this map that you see here is the number of countries that are going to be cutting public expenditure in 2021, 2022. This is this year or next year. And as you can see, the whole world is colored. This is 152 countries this year. This is, as we are speaking, countries are starting to cut public expenditure. And next year, the number of countries goes up to 159 countries. And there is a total of 192 countries on the world. So it's the large majority of countries will be cutting public expenditure. That does not mean that this is going to really happen. This is based on the fiscal projections that are presented by the IMF economists in the IMF World Economic Outlook. And this is how the IMF sees the world, that we can make it different. And that is the very important message that we need to take from here, okay? But I'm going to present it how orthodox thinking is seeing the world. So what we see in these bars, the light blue means high income countries, and the darker blue means developing countries. And what you have here is the number of countries that are cutting or contracting public expenditures since 2008, that's the financial crisis, to 2025, which is the year that the IMF fiscal projections end. And what you can see is that there, except for 2008, 2009, and 2020, which is the year of the pandemic, which at the time, then, of course, very few countries cut because countries were engaged into extending, supporting, the emergency health expenditures, supporting enterprises and social protection. For the rest, what you see is a long decade of austerity that went from 2010 to 2019. And in this decade of austerity, the important key issue to realize here is that it was often perceived as a European problem, but this is not correct. Actually, austerity was much more intense in developing countries and much more prevalent in terms of the incidence and also in the terms of the contraction. And what happens is the same again. So starting 2021, we see a huge rise in the number of countries cutting public expenditures to stay until 2025. And developing countries are more affected than high-income economies. So this is a warning, it's an alert. It does not need to be like that, but this is how the world is saying it. Because countries have been indebted and with fiscal deficits because of the expenditures in 2020 because of the pandemic. Now governments are expected to cut, but it does not need to be this way. In terms of numbers of people, and this is just reflecting that more than 6 billion people, or 85% of the world population, will be living and suffering austerity in 2022. So it means that virtually all of us, and these are numbers in case somebody's interested to do advocacy. So you have a lot of numbers in the paper, and you might want to download it. The paper is called Global Austerity Alert, and you have the reference here at the bottom and at the end of the presentation. So how are the governments really going to cut? Where are they going to cut? Now, we don't know that, but what we know is what they have been doing in the decade of austerity from 2010 to 2019. And during that period, the most normal cuts, which actually have become a recipe, you could see it happening in country after country, okay? So these were the topics that they were discussed with governments and very often implemented. And this comes from a review of nearly 800 IMF country reports during the period 2010 to 2019. So the first policy, and we have to be very aware, it is eliminating subsidies like fuel, food, or agriculture. Despite food prices are at record high in many regions. So it's very important to be aware of this. The second most common policy was wage bill cuts or caps. That means reducing or freezing the salaries and the number of public sector workers. This includes public sector workers that provide essential services to the population, like teachers, health workers, social workers, simply administrators at the local level, that they have a very important role to play in societies. It's very important to be aware of that and to try not to ensure that these cuts don't happen. The third cut, which was most common, it was rationalizing and narrow targeting welfare. And by that we mean, see, if social protection system was covering a number of people, so what they did is actually rationalize it, contracting really the number of people that were receiving benefits and focusing only on the ultra poor. But the problem of this, of course, we have to protect the ultra poor, but the problem of this was that they were living without protection to many people that they were vulnerable to. And at time of crisis, what you need to do is to expand social protection to, and to cover as many people as you can, not to contract it and target very well to the ultra poor, okay? Because that was a policy driven for cost savings. This is the wrong reason. Social protection needs to be driven by the aim to protect people. And of course, taking attention to sustainability issues, but, the drive has to be to provide income security to citizens. The fourth, more normal reform was pension and social security reforms, and it happened in an immense number of countries, more than 100. And when I was in ILO, then we estimated that pensioners in a majority of countries are going to receive lower pensions in the future because of these reforms done in the present. So it is very important actually to avoid that these pension reforms driven by cost savings are also done. Pensions can be reformed, but with the objective of balancing equity and sustainability, and do it properly according to international conventions and not just for cost savings. Then there were labor flexibilization reforms done in nearly 90 countries, and health reforms in 56 countries. And these health reforms actually left health systems less prepared to cope with the COVID pandemic. So we need to be aware of these reforms that might be repeated, because that is the kind of formula, standard formula that IMF tends to apply in all countries. Accompanying that, there are two very common reforms to raise benefits of public sector funds, and this is often increases in VAT or consumption taxes. Now, this is also something to avoid, because these are regressive taxes that the poor pay the same as the rich. We're going to see now which other options are, but this is a measure you want to avoid. And the other one was privatizations and the promotion of PPPs, which actually have significant negative social impacts as the other measures do. So these are all measures to avoid, and they have been applied. Now, the paper and a lot of evidence points how all these austerity policies have increased poverty, inequality, particularly for women, have undermined progress in human rights, and sparked social conflict. And this is an advanced graph I give you from another publication. But what it shows here is the number of protests coming from, anti-austerity protest. And what you can see since 2010, there is, they start increasing, and this is in 101 countries, and these are the different topics. But clearly, these austerity measures are sparking social conflict, poverty and inequality, and are against human rights. So they must be avoided. And overall, the key thing is these decisions affect the lives of millions of people, virtually of all citizens in a country. So they cannot be taken behind closed doors by a few technocrats in the Ministry of Finance. These decisions need to be discussed in national public dialogue, involving everybody, that must be dealing. And the key thing is that, above all, is that these measures are not needed. Actually, there's fiscal space and there are options for financing virtually in all countries, even in the poorest countries. And there are 8 options, that have been fully endorsed by the United Nations and by the international financial institutions. They have been applied by many countries in the world, and they allow countries that instead of being running with a very, very small budget, actually you will have a large budget that will allow you to achieve human rights. Okay. So these options, we cannot go into detail because it's limited time, but these options are first, increase progressive tax revenues. This means avoiding VAT and consumption taxes, and instead moving towards income and wealth taxation, such as corporate taxes, including to the financial sector that pays no or very little tax in the majority of countries. And this is absurd. A person that might be having a little corner shop, maybe pay more taxes than the financial sector does proportionally. There was a beautiful Oxfam study on that, and then we have beautiful examples. Mongolia, Zambia, Bolivia, they have been taxing mineral extraction and paying social protection with that. Mongolia paid a universal child benefit from a little tax export on copper, and Brazil paid the expansion of social security through a financial transaction tax, which was working very well for 15 years until a conservative government canceled it. So, it can be done and it works. So this is the first avenue that you must observe. The second option is to increase social security coverage by formalizing people working badly in the informal economy with good contracts and, social security coverage. That way, by expanding, the coverage of social security, you also expand the contributors, and you get, you make social insurance work properly. Third is fighting illicit financial flows, that they are illegal, as the name say. That is money laundering or tax evasion, and all these things must be avoided by societies. Fourth is restructuring or reducing debt, and we have examples from more than 60 countries that have done it, and without, and they have managed to pay less money for servicing debt and more money for, for economic and social development. Fifth, for low-income countries could be aid and transfers. Now, this is clearly does not apply for higher-income countries or middle-income countries, but there are very interesting proposals, like the proposal for a global social protection fund. So, I mean, this could help immensely in the development of social protection systems around the world. Sixth option will be to tap into fiscal and foreign exchange reserves, as Chile or Norway have done it. This might look obscure, but what I'm trying to say is that countries sometimes, because of a conservative policy, have lots of reserves in the central bank. In many countries of Africa, where food security is a real problem, and actually the central bank has, millions of dollars. They're just in the central bank. You see, that decision is a criminal decision, because people might be dying outside. So, what is the proportion of what you preserve in your central bank, or what you use for economic, social economic development? It is very important to debate publicly. Seventh option is to adopt a more accommodative macroeconomic framework. That means certain tolerance to inflation or fiscal deficits. Ultimately, the economy is for people, you see. It's not to keep a rigid macroeconomic balance. And eighth, the last option is to reallocate public expenditures, abandoning those high cost and low social impact expenditures like defense, and investing more in others. And we have very good examples like Costa Rica or Thailand that precisely cut military spending and use it for health. Now, these alternatives are very important, and they must be discussed openly in national dialogue. And I wanted to close now with just one last slide. But what happens, because we're talking here about policies that governments can do, but what happens if you're a citizen and you're concerned? What can we do, for us citizens? So there are 5 main points. First, you need to identify if your government is cutting public expenditures. For that, you can check the annex of the paper. This Oxfam has a great database, or ideally the best is that you check the latest IMF country reports, okay? Second, if your government is really cutting public expenditures, you need to stand up and state alternative demands for recovery. Let's say we want to increase the budget in education, in health, social protection, water supply, public transport, and all the services you want. Third, you need to call for national public dialogue. Now, what is very important here is the timing. Timing is of the essence. So you need to, meaningful national social dialogue can be done in a short time. It's about picking the right representatives and then do it quickly and meaningfully. And the best time is to do at the time the public budget is being designed or at the time of approval. Fourth is to carry out a timely and rapid assessment of the social impacts of the different options and alternatives, because that's going to give you the arguments why, this is better than the other. It does not need to be, encyclopedic. It just needs to be a quick reflection on which options are best. And fifth, then you agree the optimal policies through national dialogue. For those interested, there is a global campaign called End Austerity. You can check that, and there are more than 500 organizations join that. So thank you very much for the time, and I look forward to the debate. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Isabel. What you said about cuts in social welfare, and in different parts of the world calling it different names, and the reason, and what you said about poorer countries can actually solve this. This is very useful. Thank you very much. And we will, and if you like, you can share the link for Austerity Alert and the documents you mentioned in the chat, and then maybe everyone can access it. So our next speaker is Nikhil Dey. He is a social activist from India. He has played an important role in drafting legislation on India's employment guarantee law called the MREGA, and he has also been a very important part of drafting legislation on food, both of which have been very, very important legislation, which has ensured social protection, social security for millions of working poor in India. Nikhil has been working actively also for the right to information and the movement for social security. Nikhil, you have 16 minutes. Yeah, roughly.
So I've been, I think, redistributed 1 minute more. I wish Isabel's whole formulae and a set of suggestions would be taken seriously in countries like India. Unfortunately, as her map showed, we are not listening to people. We are not listening to people themselves. We are not listening to people like Isabel. We are not listening to common sense. And in a time of crisis, we are only making things even more miserable for people. So anyway, I'm going to talk about income security, but in the time of a crisis in particular, and I want to reach back into the past a little bit and also talk about the evolution where we've come. I work with Meena. Thanks very much for the introduction. I mean, I've been one very small part of many people who come together to do these extraordinary laws. But behind the laws have been extraordinary campaigns and movements. And I have worked for the last 35 years, so I've had a bird's eye view on these kinds of things. I myself work in an organization called the Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan, which is basically translates into a peasant and workers empowerment organization. And I work from a very small village in Rajasthan, but of course I'm networked with many organizations across the state and across the country. That little bit of introduction is important because I think in these huge global structures, what at least the experience I bring shows that many small groups such as our own can make a difference. We can connect. We are thinking alike. We are huge in number, even if we are individually small in particular areas. And across the globe, there is a lot of common sense, and there is a way out in the things that happen. And I'll speak very briefly about where. So I don't think we can have income security without some measure of redistribution. I mean, I think last year's in Oxfam inequality report, at least for India, demonstrated that while ordinary people their livelihoods were destroyed, their back was broken once, it's being broken again. Of course, we know what's happening in India in terms of lives. But at that same time, India's top 100 billionaires made enough to run what I'll talk about later, the entire employment guarantee program of the country, the biggest public spending program of the country for 10 years. That was their additional income. So there is a set of people who are gaining in a crisis. So if we are saying where are resources and what are resources, I think there is no doubt that it's not everyone who's doing badly. And that needs to come across, and politically it needs to come across, because that's the only way where if we can say that a crisis needs to be shared. Now, I would like to talk about, in terms of income security, briefly, I'll just introduce it. There's a law, many of you may know about it. It's not just a program, it's a law called the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. Meena referred to it briefly, and yes, I was bits and pieces part of its drafting, part of campaigning, part of many other things. That law guarantees that any rural resident, any family, can demand work within 5 kilometers of where they live, public work. And they must be given work within 15 days at minimum wages. And if they don't get work within 15 days at minimum wages, they will get an unemployment allowance. They're entitled to 100 days employment. Now that itself is a fairly powerful formulation. It came in 2005. I'll stop there and I'll go back a little. Where did the inspiration for this national law come? Because there is no equivalent huge employment guarantee anywhere in the world. It came from the state of Maharashtra during several years of continuous drought. And when they had many years of continuous drought, they sat together and as a society said that most people are suffering, but let us look at the categories who are not suffering and let's impose special taxes on them, dedicated taxes. So they started an Employment Guarantee Act that was open-ended. It was not 100 days. It was not for one person per family. It was for anyone who showed up for work. And the 4 taxes were a tax on fuel, a surcharge on sales tax, a tax on irrigated agricultural land, and a professional tax for all those who were earning a salary. They said these 4 categories of people are not suffering in the drought. It is their job to make money available for those who are suffering. That program was a fabulous inspiration for the rest of the country in 1975, but it took 30 years for the rest of India to be able to, no other state passed a similar law, even though there were many of us fighting for a right to work kind of legislation. And 30 years later, we got a national legislation. The New Deal in America, again, was public works. And it was public works at the time of the Great Depression, and it was a public works and public spending at a time of a deep crisis in America. I won't go into that because many of you know about it. But again, that was a kind of inspiration of what can come from open-ended public works at the core of the New Deal. And what Maharashtra did, what the state of Maharashtra did, how did it come back? We were all campaigning for 30 years, we didn't get it. But then came along the same BJP government that's creating so much problems for us today. The same BJP government was in the national government and it was saying India is shining. Now, India was not shining. That very small segment of India that shines no matter what happens was shining. And the rest of the people were very, very, very unhappy. And they lost that election. And they lost that election and there was an understanding in the coalition, the United Progressive Alliance that came in, that this was a reaction to
Meena, I think the connection got lost because he's not
I think it's come
in
back.
the call anymore. Yeah, he's not in the call anymore. Meena?
Nikhil, can you hear?
No, he's not in the call anymore. I think the connection got broken. Yeah, he's not here
Can you
anymore.
wait for a minute to see whether he gets back?
I can see him is still on the panelist room, but his audio is not connected. Yeah.
Nikhil, we're waiting for you.
Yeah.
I think indeed.
If he doesn't come back, we'll just have to move on and then get back to him later. Yes, he is. Nikhil? Okay, Chandan, could you just signal him in the chat that we will come back to him and then we can continue. I will hand over now to my colleague, Koen. Koen Detavernier will introduce himself and take it from here. Koen.
Good morning from Europe. My name is Koen Detavernier. I work for WSM, which stands for We Social Movements. It's a solidarity organization from Belgium. And in Asia, we support and connect the Inspire network. It's the international network for social protection rights. Now, my role is mainly advocacy work and networking in Belgium, but also helping with the link, of course, between Asia and Europe. Hence,
can you hear me?
Oh, I think Nikhil is back. Maybe it's better he can continue his explanation.
Just a moment, Nikhil. Let Koen introduce himself and then we'll get back to you.
Yeah, I'm very sorry. I'm not going to start my video in case that was the problem.
Okay.
Okay, maybe, yeah, that's the problem.
No problem. It's
Thank
solved
you.
now.
Just a
hopefully.
moment. If Koen will finish, then he'll get back to you. Yeah.
As Inspire, we've been participating in the APF for several editions and also co-organized workshops and most recently also a webinar on social protection and income security. So this is a bit our involvement in the AEPF. But I'll give the floor back to Nikhil Dey so he can conclude, and then we'll come back to the three final panelists of our session.
Koen, we need to add that Bahasa translation is available. So if you will go to interpretation and choose Bahasa, you can get Bahasa translation. Thank you. Over to you.
So we go to Nikhil Dey again, yes? Yes, Nikhil, you can continue, please.
Koen, you want to ask?
We still have a problem. So we continue with the next speaker then and come back to Nikhil later?
Yes, I would suggest that.
Okay, so then allow me to introduce. Are you back, Nikhil?
I'm back with yet another connection.
Okay, so please continue. Please continue
yes.
where you.
Shall I? Sorry, I'll try and not exceed my time, and I'll try and cut time a little bit. So, should I continue or should I wait and go after you?
Go ahead. Continue, please.
Okay. So what I was saying was that the particular time where this Employment Guarantee Act came about was at a point where India, the people of India were clear that actually these huge growth rates that India was going through at that time were going to a particular segment of the population, and most of the population was not getting what it should have got. And we got this extraordinary law. I still think it's not that it changed the entire country, but it did produce a huge new imagination amongst rights-based legislations, because guaranteed by law came a provision that anyone, anywhere could ask for work. It was universal that you could ask for work, and it would be self-selection, because if you were willing to work at minimum wages for 8 hours a day on public works, then obviously you were someone who needed it. And it was better than many other formulations, and that's what I'd like to basically very quickly talk about. So what Maharashtra did at that time was they put 4 taxes. What the national law did was it said that it will be demand-based. There will be no budgetary restriction. No matter how many people ask for work, they will be provided work with the only limitation of 100 days per year. So NREGA has had supplementary budgets, the only law that has had supplementary budgets and is not supposed to be budget curtailed. Although of course they keep trying to budget curtail it, and they keep trying to cause the problems that they do. So I'm sorry, but I think, can you still hear me? Can someone just respond, because I've lost my picture?
Yes.
Yeah, so I'll just keep speaking. And I hope, can you see me as well? So, can you see me?
Yes,
yeah, okay.
yes.
So I'll just keep carrying on. So the national law found a different route, not as good as the Maharashtra route, but nevertheless a good route by which one could go ahead with this. This provided a very minimal level of income, because it was only 100 days a year, but it was through employment. And this is a very important point, because employment provides labor rights, it provides dignity of labor, and it is not just a dole in any form at all of expenditure. And this is something I'd like to talk about. So the third point is, how did this happen? So in those 30 years between the time of the Maharashtra law and the national law, you have a series of civil society organizations and political organizations carrying on a conversation and carrying on building campaigns. And so when the national law came, the United Progressive Alliance had, most of the parties in that alliance had put it in their manifesto that they would pass a National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. Then when they came together in the alliance and they formed a national common minimum program, once again, various grassroots organizations, social movements came together, and at that time put crucial pressure to make sure that they would actually put it into the National Common Minimum Program, and it was the #1 item on that Common Minimum Program. So that's again a very, very important point that happened, and it said that immediately that would be done. Now, as far as the NREG is concerned, since 2006, when the program began, sorry, I'm really getting, can you still hear me?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, I can see myself now. So I was getting yeah, so since 2006, when the program has begun, 10 crore households take work every year. 10 crore is 100 million households, I think.
Yeah.
Get work every year under this. In the state where I am, 80 lakh households, which is almost 80% of the rural households, get work every year. In the state where I am, last year, during the Corona crisis, it was amongst the two programs, the Right to Food Act, which Meena mentioned also, and the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. Failing those two laws, there would have been widespread hunger, there would have been starvation, there would have been destitution, and as it is, India suffered, and India's working people suffered hugely, but there would have been a much, much bigger crisis. Women have entered the workforce in huge numbers because they work from their own homes and they work on employment works that suit them, and they're environmentally friendly works. In fact, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act and program, because people choose their own works, are probably the most climate friendly programs, because they have check dams, they have little water structures, they have roads, tiny little roads, not these huge mega projects, which help at the best possible way, including planning. So there are a whole bunch of statistics that we can send to show how it is a very powerful formulation of through work helping areas and helping people and being able to give people a set of rights. Now, what's important in this, that it is a combination of citizens' rights and labor rights. Now, we have often fought for labor rights, and all of us were fighting for labor rights. NREGA provided a right to any citizen to get work. And when the citizen was getting work, they were fighting for labor. So women organized and unionized. They started gherawing, or they started surrounding, or they started mobilizing to get wages on time. They started mobilizing to get the full wage. They started mobilizing to make sure, and in the state where I am, they're almost 70% of the workers are women. They made sure that they got money in their bank accounts. That money was used, and we saw little markets coming up. So it was a combination of not just and that's very important, I think, in social protection programs, that we must not see it as a dole, we must not see it only as citizens' rights, we must not see it only as labor rights. So as a series of that, many other legislations, the Street Vendors Act came up as a rights-based legislation, the Domestic Workers Act came up as a rights-based legislation, the Forest Rights Act came up as a legislation where people in forest areas would have certain rights. So it was a combination of not just a traditional dole or handout of social protection in that form, but a combination of people who could work, organize, unionize, and fight for their own rights. The second comparison I would very quickly like to make is with conditional cash transfers. We watched at that time, because it was already existing, Bolsa Familia, Oportunidadas, which were these large conditional cash transfer programs. And when the NREGA came up, people like the World Bank said, do not assure minimum wages, do not have this kind of program, because actually much better is to do conditional cash transfers, which have worked. And we were arguing for a different model. And that model, I believe, is much better, because people can ask for work. Har haath ko kaam do, kaam ka pura daam do. Every hand wants work, every work demands a just reward. That's the slogan of the entire Employment Guarantee Act campaign, and what converted itself into a law. So it actually puts power in the hands of the people, and it empowers them while they are mobilizing. And it is not someone dishing out something to them. They are at the core of development. I think I've lost track of time because of that cut. So I think I'll very quickly try and conclude. And I'm sorry if I've gone over in terms of time, but I want to get to say that the right to information is one more quick mention I'd like to make about transparency and accountability to the people. We cannot have programs run top down by government. We have to have people to be able to take power into their own hands, like this particular law. And so the India's right to information law also gave public audit powers to people. And we had a series of rights-based legislations which have made legislation far more meaningful and powerful, which were the Right to Education Act, which were the Street Vendors Act, which was the Forest Rights Act, as I mentioned. Like that, there are about 10 legislations that came about in those 10 years. And they continue to be the backbone of what people can fight for. So it's not just social protection, but it's also to be backed by law, and backed by law where people are at the core of it, and where there is redistribution of income, and where there is more equality in the economy. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nikhil. Unfortunately for the interruption, but no problem. I'm glad you could finish your explanation and your statement. Let's move on now to our third speaker. The speakers who come now only have a very limited amount of time, about 7 minutes maximum. This should allow us to leave some time for questions and answers. May also repeat that if you have questions, don't put them in the chat because they will get lost there. Put them at the bottom. There is a button you can push for Q&A. If you put your questions there, the chances that we see them is a lot bigger. I'll give the floor now to Francine Mestrum. She has a PhD in social sciences, and she worked for several Belgian universities. Done a lot of research on social justice, globalization, poverty, and equality. She is actively engaged in the Council of the World Social Forum and co-convening, together with Meena, the social justice cluster in this very Asia-Europe People's Forum. Francine drafted a discussion text, which we already shared in the chat, on the income security, called Income Security Options and Choices. And choices and options because, as we all know, the way income security mechanisms are being developed and implemented, it matters. Yeah, and also an essential part of what Francine probably will tell us is that more comprehensive approaches for social commons are needed. Francine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so very much. I'm very happy to be here and very happy to see that so many people are listening. Let me briefly explain why we made this paper. And that is not only because two of our organizations were already working on income security, but obviously the very first and main argument is that income security is a fundamental element of social protection, and social protection is a fundamental element of social justice. And the second reason is that at this moment, more and more people are speaking about basic income. And the problem with basic income is that this concept has so many different meanings for many, many different people. So in fact, our main objective was to create clarity. Because people speak about basic income. For some people, this means a universal basic income. For other people, this means just a kind of income floor. For other people, it means a sort of kind of cash grants, etc., etc. So what we have done is just create clarity by giving an overview of the many possibilities that exist for guaranteeing income security to people. And that means in the paper is discussed the point of universal basic income, is discussed the point of the universal dividend, which I think personally is a very interesting proposal. We discuss the minimum income proposals that exist, the different mechanisms for cash grants, etc., etc. So we highly recommend you to look at the paper. I'm not going into all these different proposals. I just would like to focus on one basic point, And that is that all people in the world, whatever the development level of their countries, all people have the same needs. And these needs can be met with good systems of social protection. And that is why this income security point clearly fits into this broad vision that we have on social protection. And Meena already mentioned our charter. That is the text with all the basic principles that we want to have respected, which does not mean we want uniform systems all over the world. On the contrary, all countries and all people will have to define what kind of social protection they want, what mechanisms they want to be put in place. But in our vision, social protection means not only social security, insurance systems, but also public services, which are so very important, and on which Kate will talk in a minute. We also think of labor law, and that is what Nikhil has just been talking about. And we talk, of course, also about assistance for poor people. But as I also clearly focused on in the paper, income security in all markets economy in the first place are very necessary, because that is what will help you not to feel hungry, not to be afraid to not being able to pay the rent, not being afraid of not being able to go to a doctor to pay the school fees for your children. And it is in that way that we can improve the welfare and the well-being of people, because that is exactly what it is about, to be free of want and free of fear. That is what income security can help to resolve. And again, it is not enough to speak about some basic elements of social security. What this COVID crisis has so clearly shown is that it is not enough to have a doctor, to have a hospital. You also need clean water, clean air, you need housing. All these elements are so very important. And let me conclude by focusing on two more points. The one is effectively this COVID crisis, because there is a silver lining in the COVID crisis, and that is that this has shown our deep interdependence. I cannot take care of my health if you do not take care of your health. I cannot take care of my health if you do not wear a mask. I cannot take care of my health if you refuse a vaccine. We're all dependent on one another. And I think that is a very important point that we have to focus on. We have to emphasize all the time. And the second point that I would like to emphasize, which is very important, in the ways that we have to organize social protection and labor law and social security. More and more people are talking about the lack of responsibility of corporations. And I think it was Vandana Shiva who on Monday in our opening session used the concept of the zero cost economy. And that is indeed what is happening, step by step by step by step. Corporations are shifting away from their responsibilities. They do not want to pay taxes. They do not want to pay wages. And that is why most of them are effectively asking for universal basic income, so governments can pay people instead of corporations. And they are running away from their responsibility for the well-being and the welfare of people, and that is for paying for social protection. Corporations have to pay their workers and have to pay decent wages and have to pay for the social protection of workers. And that is a very important point that we also have to emphasize, because indeed, if we talk about income security, it is a shared responsibility. It is a responsibility of governments, of corporations, and indeed also of individuals. So please have a look at the document. It explains you everything about the difference and the many mechanisms we have for giving people this freedom from want and freedom from fear. And I think that if we are really aware of our interdependence, and if we can spread that message more and more and more, we can indeed fight for social protection for all of us, because that is, I think, in the awareness of our interdependence, that if I cannot take care of myself, you cannot take care of yourself, that is what we need to know and need to spread as a message. So I hope I did not go over my 5 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Francine, for these valuable insights. You only went over your time a very, very little bit. Let me shift and give the floor to Kate Lappin. Kate is the Regional Secretary for the Asia and Pacific region at Public Services International. And Public Services International is a global union federation of more than 700 trade unions, representing more than 30 million workers in 154 countries. Of course, as a union, it defends trade union and workers' rights, and it fights for universal access to quality public services. And it brings the voices of all these workers to international institutions. And Kate will bring us the perspective of Public Services International, the perspective of a union also, on the importance, which already mentioned by Francine, of public services and its link with income security. Please, Kate, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Koen, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me and to this great panel. So far, I think the speakers have really set the stage for what the position that PSI would take on social protection, especially, I think, some of the points that are in the paper, the alarms that Isabel raised earlier around the threats of austerity and the impact that will have on public services. And in this paper that Francine has drafted, raising some important points about the breadth of social protection and the need to look at all aspects of social protection, particularly public services as our core element of social protection, the right to an income. And I'm also, in these few minutes I have, going to suggest that another aspect of social protection, or one of the most important parts actually of being able to address these threats of austerity, of growing inequality, and of the right to a fair and just income, is actually trade unionism, and that trade unionism should be seen as a form of social protection. Before I sort of go a bit more into detail, I think, as was mentioned, PSI represents workers who deliver public services. And of course, at this moment, the work that they do is being appreciated around the world by both the public and governments. And I think there's a newfound recognition of the importance of both public services, public sector workers, but also of the capacity for governments to manage our economies, and shows us that they can, that all the rhetoric we've been told about, market-led economies isn't able to keep us safe, and that we must have governments step in, that global supply chains have left us vulnerable, and then in fact we do need a different system to ensure that we're kept safe from different types of crises, and particularly this global health crisis. But I think, as Isabel has pointed out, one of the biggest threats is that appreciation is not being transferred to a new system. At this stage, we don't have evidence that the recognition that the public has shown to public sector workers and to public services is being matched by government action. We don't see large-scale injections into long-term public goods or into increases into permanent staff in public services, even in health. We see short-term stopgaps and in many countries an increased attack on workers and public services, particularly in the Asia region. We've seen in Indonesia the passing of the omnibus bill that will decimate a number of labour rights and allows for further privatisation. So it's packaged all of that together, privatisation of energy and other services and the undermining of existing labour rights protection. We've seen in India the labour codes pass, which again completely undermines the existing labour laws and consolidates them into a very minimalistic approach to labour protection. And we've seen some states completely suspend labour laws, including your most basic laws around minimum wages and so forth. And of course, across the region, we also see the growth of authoritarian governments and being matched with a crackdown on trade unionists. So we're not seeing what we might hope for, which is a recognition of the need for a new system. And I think it's interesting to see that there's some research into previous pandemics that shows, whilst this is could be a turning point, every other pandemic in the last century has led to a growth in inequality. In the countries that have experienced it, there's been a 1.25% increase in the Gini index to demonstrate that there's inequality. I wanted to just quickly share up my screen of a couple of points that highlight some of what's been going on. So we've seen two headlines last year in 2020, separate headlines that I think tell the same story. First of all, we saw that billionaires had made 3.9 trillion. They added 3.9 trillion to their wealth. And at another day, we saw, surprise, surprise, workers have lost 3.7 trillion last year. And this is obviously on the back of 20, 30 years of growing inequality around the world. It's obviously an injustice, the work of workers who really are the ones on the front lines, whether it be public service workers, whether it be food delivery workers, whether it be transport workers, are on the front lines of keeping us safe, and they're yet losing money. And we know that the virus itself has been spread through precarity. But there's another reason I think that this is really alarming. It's what happens to that $3.9 trillion. When that money gets put into the hands of billionaires, it goes again to privatizing services. It goes into investing in political power. And it certainly doesn't go into taxes or into investing in our public services. And we might think that that in the last year, our health services would have been restored to public services. But instead, what we saw is that there were more private equity global healthcare buyouts in 2020 than any other year. So, and foreign capital has searched for opportunities to buy up local healthcare, whether it be local, private or public, to grow larger and larger healthcare corporations, or, as I said, owned by private equity and unfortunately some funds. And for the very first time, that the largest amount of those was in Asia. So every year when this has been tracked, it's been, in Europe or US often buyouts. But last year, for the first time, it was in Asia. And I think this is really alarming. So that money that goes to billionaires is going into taking away these kind of services. But I want to emphasize, just with this last slide, it doesn't have to be that way, as other speakers have said. And this is one of the reasons I say that one element of social protection is trade unionism. You can see here that when trade union membership is high, inequality reduces. It's not surprising, but you can see that direct correlation here between the growth in inequality and the reduction in union membership. And that's what we're obviously at one of the lowest points, and this correlates with some of the work of other economists that have showed the level we are in inequality is matching some of those very most unequal times. And I think there's a clear indication, and this isn't just by accident, of course, there's a global attack on trade unions and the right to organise. And in our region, in the Asia Pacific region, perhaps more particularly dangerous to be a trade unionist. It's not only inequality, of course, that trade unions play a role in protecting. We know that trade unions can keep us healthier, safer, can protect our public services, and also can be part of a social justice movements for things like addressing climate justice, gender equality, racism, and other issues of social justice. During this pandemic, for example, unionised aged care had a 30% lower mortality rate in one study than non-unionised care. And so this is, I think, needs to be part of our shared campaigns for social justice and for social protection. I'll just stop sharing and
Okay.
Just lastly, I just wanted to wrap up with a couple of points on the paper, which I really do appreciate the paper that the background paper that Francine has provided. There are some really important points in there that I think are similar to our own view on social protection. And one of them is around the concern we have that the private sector may back in behind a universal basic income. And part of the reason they do that is because, as said, they want to transfer the obligation to actually pay a decent wage to governments rather than to the private sector. They've presented the idea that it's inevitable that we have precarious work, low paid work that you can't live on. And their answer to that is this idea of universal basic income. And I do think that, you know, there are obviously options there, but we have to be very careful about embracing the idea whilst there is such a lack of public funds. So until we get all of the quality public services that we need, until they are fully funded, until we fix the tax avoidance that Isabel mentioned and the other issues around public revenue, I think we should be very careful about any arguments for universal basic income that come from the World Bank or from the private sector. And I really recommend the paper, key messages in there. And yeah, thank the organisers for giving that careful perspective that is required, I think, in our movements. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Kate, for your insights and your trade union perspective, which is an important addition to more academic insight we often also get at the AEPF and insights from other social movements. As I always say, you can't be a people's movement if you don't include the workers' movement. But now let's shift to our final speaker, Maris de la Cruz. Maris is from the Philippines, and she has a long track record as a campaigner and a networker in the Philippines and in Asia. She has campaigned against privatization of drinking water and for the cancellation of debt, and since several years focuses her work on social protection issues. She is also the coordinator of the Network for Transformative Social Protection, which actually has its roots, if I'm well informed, in this very Asia-Europe People's Forum. Now, Maris will present us the main takeaways from a webinar we held earlier in April with the AEPF, which was organized jointly by 3 networks in Asia who focus on social protection. the NTSP, the Network for Transformative Source Protection itself, AROSP, the Asia Roundtable on Source Protection, and Inspire, the International Network for Source Protection Rights Asia. So together we organized this webinar, and Marlos will present the takeaways from testimonies and inputs that we gathered from different grassroots movements, trade unions, social movements, cooperatives, all kinds of initiatives, going from government-led mechanisms to very small-scale income security and income guarantee initiatives. So Maris, the floor is yours to give us what we learned and what we should and could take away from this webinar.
Thank you so much, Koen, for the introduction and providing background on the webinar. So we had 7 speakers who provided critical points and recommendations during the webinar, which are worth reflecting and pursuing in current initiatives addressing income security and the broader social protection programs. The speakers were from ILO, Nuno Cunha, from GFONT, a trade union in Nepal, Patamaba, a union of informal workers in the Philippines, KSBSI, another trade union in Indonesia, from United Freelancers in Belgium, composed of platform workers, from CSO, MSN, Monitoring Sustainability of Globalization, a Malaysian-based CSO working with trade unions and parliamentarians, and lastly, MNET, which is composed of migrant workers working in Vietnam. I would like to share with you now the highlights and key takeaways from the webinar. One, it was stressed that the country cases have validated or supported studies showing huge shock caused by the pandemic on workers' employment, income and rights, including access to sufficient social protection programs. Nuno Cunha of ILO shared that precarious jobs and vulnerable employments have further grown, affecting more the wage workers than the self-employed, and most of new jobs created are in informal economy, thus increasing informality globally. But there seems to be a lack of understanding of the extent of this informality, particularly on its size and impact, especially the invisibility of informal workers and the difficulty in reaching them as well as making their voices heard. This invisibility of informal workers therefore requires a change in approach of the government. Aside from informality or growing precarious jobs, the pandemic has also caused health risks for business owners, workers, and customers, and alarmingly, sale of productive assets, especially in the absence of savings or access to other measures of income security, thus jeopardizing the workers' future and the population's livelihoods. Another point under this item, there's an increase in the number of informal workers experienced in country cases shared during the webinar, largely due to massive unemployment or job losses. In Malaysia, it was shared that the unemployment rate of 4.6% last year from 3.3% in 2019 was the highest since 1993. The government's economic stimulus program that was implemented in less than 1 year to mitigate economic shocks was insufficient and failed to address income insecurity, or have also wasted opportunities to implement the much needed reforms, especially in social protection. There are 3 major problems identified that need to be addressed by the government. These are the employment-related social protection programs for informal workers and the growing COVID-related poverty. Meanwhile, 5% and 6% of the total 138 million workforce in Indonesia were also unemployed and underemployed respectively. 46 million of these workers work less than 35 hours a week, and 100 million are not covered by the 4 social security programs in its BPJS insurance system. In Belgium, United Freelancers shared that majority of self-employed are in a non-standard type of work. They are neither employee nor employer and without social security. During the pandemic, these platform workers who are did not receive any government support, as they are not covered by social security rights enjoyed by regular workers, or their social security, if any, are lower than the social security benefits of employees in the standard type of work. These platform workers need to defend their working conditions through forming or joining a union. Self-employment is used or abused to bypass labor laws and social security in Belgium. The government has institutionalized this informal work to the detriment of self-employed workers. This appears to be a double penalty for informal work. In restaurants and cafes, they lost their job and then they tried to have an income working for platforms. However, in the platform economy, they don't have anymore these social rights. Due to the crisis and government institutionalizing informal work, there is huge influx of new workers going to platforms. So this new non-standard type of work and workers in this platform have to be covered by the social security programs. And the unions need to denounce the non-standard work and absence of social security for the workers, and insist that social security should be implemented or enjoyed as well by them. Likewise, the Philippines is not spared from high unemployment rate. Issues faced by workers in the informal economy in the Philippines include invisibility in statistics, participation and representation, access to productive resources, as well as access to social security, justice, and protection at workplaces. Lastly, the recognition or valuation of reproductive and care work for women is also a continuing concern for informal workers, especially women. The pandemic has caused among patamaba or informal workers fear of COVID infection, lack of mobility resulting in further loss of jobs and incomes, stress affecting mental health, and impact on daily food consumption, as well as insufficient government assistance, limited production and operation, and reduced income of community or home-based enterprises. On the other hand, the patamaba in the Philippines noted that the pandemic has also opened opportunities such as alternative employment or income sources for them. For instance, some informal workers have shifted to PPE production and have engaged in acquiring new skills, including digital marketing for members, urban gardening, access to relief operations, and other livelihood programs. Meanwhile, in Nepal, it has also experienced higher unemployment. In fact, the rate has doubled during the pandemic. Only 68% are employed, while 2.3% are totally unemployed and 30% unemployed. This unemployment is being addressed by its government in accordance to the right to employment and right to work enshrined in its laws. Second takeaway in the webinar is that the health and economic crisis have shown the great importance of social protection and the need to reform the present social protection programs towards its universality, sustainability, and sufficiency. ILO's Koen highlighted that during this crisis, we all realized the great importance of social protection, the absence of which would have made the situation even worse. In addition, the impact on and needed change of approach on informal workers have also been stressed. This was shared by Belgium's United Freelancers, highlighting that nobody can deny the importance of social security for all. The speaker emphasized that in this uncertain world, social security is important and should be a universal right for anybody, for any worker, whatever the status. We have to change the current system linking social security with standard work because a lot of workers are not in this traditional situation. Further, there are governments, like in the case of Belgium, where a new standard type of work was created, such as in the digital economy, with more uncertain type of work. And it is important for unions to denounce this and to insist on building what social security could and should be in this period. The third and fourth points or highlights, it is important for various sectors, especially workers, to develop and advocate for income security programs and the broader social protection system. People's organizations and trade unions have developed and implemented programs, some in partnership with the government and other institutions, in order to provide income security and other gaps and fill the other gaps in the government's social protection programs. The ILO highlighted that as social protection is needed to boost economy and speed up recovery, to ensure increase in income level and that the economy can work. And it is also important not to go back to the past and keep these social protection measures as long as possible. We should keep the message that this is an opportunity to begin building the social protection system that will also include gender and disaster responsiveness, and that social protection can contribute to broader recovery plans and policies to address structural, economic, and social weaknesses. Moreover, we need to think seriously, especially for countries with very low spending. Social dialogue and international labor standards are needed to develop an effective and more responsive support. Support and extension programs covering non-contributory and tax-based and formalization should be among the priorities in reforming the social protection system. He called on all stakeholders to work for a better normal, not so much for those who have much, but for those who so obviously have too little. He also noted some concerns that have to be addressed. That social protection measures implemented in this time of pandemic have been massive in size and some with new features and innovative in forms. Yet there have been glaring gaps, especially for poorer states, and that it is difficult when there are no social protection mechanisms in place. For countries that need to have social protection in place, we need to institute or establish an effective system to also prepare for potential crises coming, as shown in trends. Social protection is likely to become even more relevant in the emerging or recovery phase of the crisis and the recovery. And for recovery, we need prolonged measures taken and also make them more sustainable. Government measures also often miss those in the informal sector who fall between the cracks, resulting in them not receiving any social protection programs. There is also a missing middle that needs to be tackled. They are not registered as poor, not for safety net approach, but not also informal social security. The income security programs that are currently implemented, while insufficient, can be a start towards having more effective and broader programs. In Nepal, in 2018, the Prime Minister Employment Program was launched and adopted, with 1.7 million workers registered in the program in 721 out of 753 LGUs in 2019. It has a total allocation of 3.1 billion Nepali rupee, which also reflects the seriousness of government in creating the needed employment for workers. However, the program has not generated much support or registration, as the number has declined in the recent years. Another program to realize the right to work provided daily wages, but the number of workers covered by this program has been decreasing as the number of applicants has also been decreasing. These programs have fostered flow of income in rural municipalities and the unemployed. The impact on cities was lesser, but more visible than in rural local government units. The speaker from Nepal noted that this important income support is insufficient. Therefore, financial support, including increasing the budget, is needed, not only addressing wages. Furthermore, other support to the rural government is needed in order to ensure employment for the people. He emphasized if there is job security, income security will also be attained. In the Philippines, programs employed by informal workers such as Patamaba are more on providing livelihood in the framework of solidarity economy and mutual benefit programs, promoting leaderpreneurship and entrepreneurship is also essential. The agenda for decent work should also highlight capacity building, asset reform, participation and representation, employment, and economic empowerment. In Indonesia, meanwhile, income security is addressed by the government by pursuing unemployment insurance schemes that will cover more workers, including the youth. The government has instituted the pre-employment card system for youth job seekers, wherein government pays the tuition for the youth's vocational training, and the unemployment insurance, which include tuition for skills training, cash transfers, and job search assistance for workers who lost their jobs. Unemployment insurance is a needed response or action to support those who lost or are without jobs and avoid the impacts of multiple crises experienced in 1998 Asian financial crisis. These measures have attracted the participation of only less than half of the targeted workers. To make these schemes more effective and truly responsive, KSBI emphasized that real social dialogue at provincial level as well as compliance of employers have to be implemented. A broader coverage should also include informal workers in the unemployment insurance needed. Sorry, I've already exceeded my time.
Yes, you did.
Sorry. One minute.
Okay.
1 minute. Okay, in Malaysia, this is two last items. In Malaysia, MSN together with labor groups are pushing for more comprehensive social protection system to cover various groups. A plan for implementation of minimum wage poverty line index to improve quality of life. This will cover the SMEs, the informal workers, as well as the general population, especially the poor. The government should provide adequate handouts for a more targeted assistance based on the needs of the people. The Malaysian representative highlighted that the COVID-19 pandemic should be a wake-up call to address the failures of social protection system for Malaysians, using the momentum created by the crisis to build a universal social protection rather than a market-based solution for those who can afford it and safety nets for the poor. The beneficiaries of this system are the consumer, who use and consume the goods and services. Hence, the money will also fall back to the market and increase their purchase demand and boost the economic growth and market dynamism. In Vietnam, Mnet highlighted that the emergency relief for migrant workers should also include the internal migrant workers. And last point, the national and international solidarity among institutions and countries are needed to develop and implement effective, sufficient, and sustainable social protection system, including income security measures. Further, long-term advocacy and continued pressure are needed to realize this. Our Indonesian colleague highlighted the importance of uniting all workers and to have a unified social security system to be defended also by workers. To end, here are the final takeaways from the presentations of speakers. Make partnerships, engage with parliament, scientists, and other stakeholders, including NGOs, and join forces at national and international level. Workers' organizations cannot do it alone. And lastly, we should need to keep campaigning. That's all. Thank you
very much. It was, of course, a long and very interesting webinar we had in April, so a lot could be shared. But indeed, an interesting overview of different kinds of initiatives, measures, policies, and advocacies that are put in place by civil society, by governments altogether to guarantee social security and income security. May I refer now to Chandan, who has been checking on the Q&A box.
Yes.
To ask some of the most interesting questions that you have found in the Q&A.
Yes, I'll be very happy to read a few questions very quickly. Some are already addressed to the speakers, and some are in the very general questions. So let me just quickly read out those questions. So one is, please forgive me if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. It's a Reinhard Huss. What is the role of modern monetary theory or sovereign money to avoid austerity measures and finance social protection? That's the one question. Any speakers can choose to respond. Shobha Shukla, this questions for the Nikhil ji. How do we ensure the public interest laws like for NAREGA and RTI laws go not lose the sheen with a change in government? Also, what is your take on the recent farm laws that has led to one of the greatest farmers movement? So another question is Erwin Pohavan. Where do we locate wage theft? This has been a long-standing problem with the migrant workers and even workers' time. Fung Wo is writing, could the speaker explain more on increasing social security average for those in the informal economy? How could it extend state revenue? Let me just quickly read a couple of more questions. Yes, Daini Inda, she's writing that how can we make sure the government answer our needs, especially health and economic services, while they face huge debt from the IMF or the World Bank? This debt also the public, this debt is also the public should pay from their taxes. And last question is from Bismo to again Nikhilji. If people work in the employment guarantee receive certain amounts of money, how about people who already work or have profession in the same of job? How it's affect their job and income? So these are the questions I could find out, Koen. Thank you.
Could I just, Koen, if I could just flag, there's one issue, one question here, which perhaps is outside of our particular, thematic, which is the one on the farm laws. I think that's not to do with income. Maybe we should take that only if we have time at the end. So I would just ask that if you could directly contact Nikhil maybe and email him, maybe he can deal with that. Otherwise, all the other questions. So how are we doing this, Koen? Shall we give each speaker some time, because we have not much time. So maybe a minute or two per speaker to deal with the questions.
Let's start with the two keynote speakers. Certain questions were especially addressed, I think, to Isabel on the financing options. So maybe Isabel, you can start, and then Nikhil Dey can answer the question, which was directed to him, and then the other speakers can come in if they want to comment and complement on the other questions. So I would say, Isabel, you can start.
Thank you. They are actually very, very interesting questions, and it's very difficult to answer in such a short time. But let me start by two that really caught my attention. It was a comment from Farouk from Pakistan and Dayani, and they're related. Farouk comments that actually the measures, the austerity measures, are actually being implemented in Pakistan, and that's kind of a surprise. Let me say that it was a surprise to us when we were researching. The set of measures I described in the presentation and in the paper, they're actually being repeated in many, many, many countries. And that gives us the opportunities for some global action that will help at the national level. Because reality is, each country lives it always as a surprise, what is happening, what are the reforms being proposed, but they are being mushroomed like plip, 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 plip in all countries. So reality is we are more powerful if we somehow give, the possible solutions and assist internationally or regionally, in that. Diani comments, how to convince then officials in the IMF and World Bank and government. Well, it's always the same thing. We do need to call for a national dialogue. This is part of good governance. All countries have signed international conventions on national dialogue. And this national dialogue needs to happen with trade unions, employers, as representative democratic civil society, etc. And, main stakeholders in a country, but it needs to be public and it needs to, reach optimal solutions that work for the majority of people. Okay, so that's very, that's there. And I think I have consumed my minute, but there's another very good question by Phong Bu on how to formalize people in the informal sector. I don't know if
answer it, please. Go ahead.
Okay, there are fantastic examples from Latin America, and always an example is better than a theoretical explanation. The key thing is to provide good contracts to people that are at the moment working in informality. And why will an entrepreneur do that? Well, how it worked in Latin America in programs called Monotax, and you can Google that, Monotax in Uruguay or Simples in Brazil. It is the same program. So what they did is actually requires a degree of government subsidy. So the government will subsidize health and social security for those workers that will be participating into the program. And so then the enterprise had an interest on providing a contract, a working contract, legally binding to the worker. And that way you will expand then the coverage of social security, which is, obviously very important. Obviously, with time, the more contributors to have to social security, you have also more beneficiaries, but you increase the weight of social security and make it robust and sustainable for the future. So that is a way of the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe Nikhil Dey can answer the question model directed to him on the risk of losing mechanisms and instruments when governments change.
Yeah, so thanks very much. There were a couple of questions, I think, that were addressed to me, so I'll very quickly go through them. Firstly, the losing of the sheen of these laws, especially when you have a hostile government. I'd like to let everyone know that when this current Modi government took over, it made a statement, the Prime Minister made a statement on the floor of the House that I will not I will not do away with the NRAGA law. I will preserve it as a monument of failure. So I will make sure it reminds everyone of how much it can fail. But that very same government had to time and time again turn to that law, even before the last year's pandemic. And in the pandemic last year, the only real measure where there was some protection provided was an increase of 40% in the budget for the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act by that very same government who had derided the law. That government has in fact created a monument to arrogance and insensitivity, which is a central vista, a huge parliament building being built in the middle of this pandemic. But real things that have to, they don't want riots on their hands, and NREGA has shown its strength in its own way. The second question was about, so how will NREGA affect other workers? I think I'd like to say that's what I understood by that question, those who are in the regular workforce. I think the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, for the first time in India, made minimum wages a kind of reality. Because there were so many people who said we can go and get minimum wages on NREGA, so you'll have to pay us more in the workforce. So it actually helped all other workers. People did not necessarily want to come to these public works, but they said, if you don't pay us enough, we'll go there. So it made it a reality, it created a flaw, and what we keep arguing is it actually was a market mechanism where there were maybe 100 million workers here, but there were millions of other workers elsewhere who were benefited by this. So this kind of market mechanism, that if it could be seen like that. The third thing I'd very quickly like to say is on the farm laws. The question is, another law that was very useful was the National Food Security Act last year. And we have 100 million tons of food grain just now and starving people. We had last year as well. And the government did have to let go a lot because the National Food Security Act says 75% of the households should be given in rural areas and 67% all over should be given a certain amount of food grain every month. They had to increase that. They had to increase the numbers. They had to increase it for migrant. The farm laws and its connection with that is because there is state procurement of that food grain, it is available for distribution. So I don't want to go into it in greater detail, Meena, but just to say that the farm laws have a connection because those farm laws are meant to destroy that public procurement. That public procurement is extremely important. That enables
Yeah.
I'm afraid we lost Nikhil Dey again. But maybe
he's back.
He's back, but maybe
yeah, did I go? I have one more line to say, that I think the opportunity that exists for all of us across the world to mobilize people when there is this crisis. Health is a shining example. We do not have a right to health law. We have a miserable public health system. We have people dying every single day. The private sector is not servicing even the rich with it's meant to service. This is an opportunity when all of us can move to say, we need a public health system. We need sufficient spending. We need sufficient accountability from that public health system. And we need it to answer to people.
Thank you. Is there any of the other panelists who wants to reply to or add to? Maybe Kate or Francine? Yes, go ahead.
Because I saw a question on the universal basic income, and I think it is important to briefly go into that. First of all, I want to thank Nikhil for his last words, which was so very important, and I think we have to take that into account. About the UBI, there are so many arguments against it that I will put on the chat, where you can find a lot of articles where you can find all the arguments. Let me just now focus on 2 points. First is the solidarity. I mean, the basic difference between the social protection system and the UBI, Universal Basic Income, is the fact that social protection is based on solidarity amongst all of us. We show solidarity with the rest of society. I pay for healthcare because someone else can be ill and need money to pay for good health. Whereas I can be ill and someone else will pay for, not directly, but through the pool of contributions. Social protection means we care for each other and we pay for each other. Whereas a UBI is a solidarity going from the state to the citizen, from the state to another citizen, from the state to another citizen. It is not a collective horizontal solidarity anymore. And that, I think, is the main difference, that social protection provides for horizontal structural solidarity among citizens, paid for also by employers and organized by governments. I think that is the main difference, and that is why you will always defend social protection. And a second argument that is very, very important is that we have to look, because you mentioned freedom. Freedom is a collective thing. It is not an individual thing. We have the same discussion with the COVID crisis now. People who think they have the individual right to refuse a vaccine, the individual right to not respect the lockdown. This is a collective thing. And you will never be obliged to do work that you do not like and that you do not want to do. But we should be aware, all of us, that there is a certain amount of socially necessary work that has to be shared by all of us. So you cannot just opt out individually. That is not possible, or that should not be possible. So freedom is a collective thing, and I think we have to look at it in this collective way, and in that way you end up with social protection, where we all care for each other. It is not that I take care of myself and then all the rest. Because what basic income means, in fact, is that the government gives you a certain amount of money and then says, no, you take care of yourself. You take care of yourself. It's not our responsibility anymore. And the same for corporations. Whereas we take care of ourselves collectively. Thank you.
Maybe I see one question that could be directed more directly to Kate Lappin on wage theft. Where do we locate wage theft? It's been a long-standing problem with migrant workers and even workers more in general. Kate, do you have an answer to that?
Yes, I mean, I could touch on that. There's also a question I wanted to touch on in relation to trade and in Germany. But just briefly on wage theft, I mean, I'm based in Australia, where in my state, wage theft has been legislated now as a criminal offence. And I think we need to do that around the world, that recognise that this is a type of theft, and people who commit wage theft should go to prison. So that's one method, I think, that we need to, you know, why do we allow some people to get away with theft where, you know, small scale theft is criminalised, but large scale theft, which is usually from corporations on a large scale, we're not, you know, this is with the cases have been found to be completely underpaying or lots of workers, not just individuals. So that's one way to start dealing with wage theft. We should have a global movement, and including in the ILO, to have standards that say wage theft is a criminal offence, and those who commit it need to face consequences in the way any other theft does. I wanted to just quickly mention there was a question about trade agreements, and I put in the answer there that we have PSI initiated together with all of the global unions in Asia and Pacific region, a group called Unions for Trade Justice, and exactly agree with the question that trade agreements undermine the capacity for trade unions to effectively bargain, but they also undermine public services and social protection. I mean, they you know, particularly allow for corporations to be protected when they privatise public goods and make it very difficult to bring those public goods back into public hands. And at the same time, you know, where the pandemic has shown us, of course, that trade rules really undermine our public good and our public health. And just very quickly on that last point, if it's okay, just to say about the universal basic income, an important point is that in the models that, for example, the World Bank or others will promote, the income will replace public services. It will be like a voucher type system where, you know, you've got in the US sometimes these vouchers for education. And as Francine said, that's not a solidarity model. When we have a voucher and we're told, you know, everybody has the same voucher regardless of your health, you have to go to find a health system, a health provider to give you health care. It will drive up prices of health, just like it does in the US, you know, and whether this be related to health or energy or to, you know, water or education. If we all have an income, it will be an inequity of the same level. It won't accommodate for who needs it. And the other part there is that the World Bank, when they put this in their report, it was because they said that wages can't be secured because of the future of work and on platform workers. They're saying that corporations don't have to pay a decent living wage. I mean, that's not inevitable. We don't have to accept that. We have to organise and say that, no, we have a right to a living wage, and we're not going to replace the right to a living wage with some idea of a universal basic income, which won't even come from corporations because they're not paying their taxes. It will come from us who pay taxes either through our income or through our, you know, VAT, etc. So that I just wanted to also add to that. Thanks.
Very much. I'll give the floor now to Meena, so to conclude, maybe.
Okay, I can see one more question here which hasn't been, I think, addressed. We're from Bismo Sanyato. To Nikhil, should we take that or are we out of time? Chandan, how are we for time?
We have still some 10 minutes.
10 minutes, yeah.
Okay. So maybe because this seems like a question nobody has addressed yet, and Bismo Sanyato wants to know if people work, mainly to Nikhil, if people work in employment guarantee schemes for a certain amount of money, how about people who already work in the same place and the same jobs? How does it affect their job and income? So yeah. Nikhil, could you come in on that? Because on some of the other things, I think now Reinhardt and I think there's a clear, I mean, Francine has answered that question, but I think it's something on which there needs to be more discussion, for which we don't have time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Meena, I kind of addressed it actually. I think from what I understood from that was there are people who come to do certain kinds of jobs on employment guarantee works, and there are people who are already doing those jobs. So how are they affected? So the public works, to my mind, is a huge pool. It is not limited, and so it's not that someone is displacing someone else, number one. The second question is that are you affecting people negatively in that by employment guarantee program giving only minimum wages, whereas you may have been earning more, and therefore are you negatively affecting them? Actually, the opposite has happened, because these are works in which, since people now can go to work at minimum wages, as I mentioned, it's the first time that minimum wages became a reality in the country. Otherwise, it was a law which nobody enforced. But now, because people could go to work in large numbers and get minimum wages, others who were contractors and people employing people from those areas for other works or even similar kinds of contract works had to pay more to attract them away from the employment guarantee works and to be able to get them. And that's why there was such a sharp pushback, both from industry and the contract workers and from large farmers, saying employment rates have gone up. The wage rates have gone up, and employment guarantee is affecting us negatively. And they did in fact have some degree of success in trying to stop the march of minimum wages and the amount of minimum wages going up. So it has actually had a very good, strong, good effect. But the power of all these workers, even though they are huge in number, is still not big enough for them. And even though it provided the first time a platform across the country for rural workers to organize, because they were all going on similar works in a similar platform, and they could have organized into one large union or many large unions, the nature of rural work still remains, informal work in India still remains so divided that those kinds of increased advantages have not been as quick, and there has been a lot of political the lobby that employs people, whether it's industry, whether it's contractors, or whether it's people who are large farmers or people on plantations or people who employ people in rural areas in large numbers. All of them actually continually try and say that NREGA is undermining the regular labor market. And that's because it's increasing the power of workers in that market.
Thank you, Nikhil. So it's time to wrap up. Thank you very much. Large number of people, I think almost 90 people have attended it. Thank you very much. I hope we can continue this discussion, because this is part of a very core agenda of the social justice cluster. Do become part of what we will hope to create, a mailing list on some of these issues. And do write to us. Chandan, if you could maybe share your email there, then people can write. Yeah. And keep in touch. And the thing is that income security, job guarantees, guarantee of all kinds of public services, access to public services, all these are linked up, as has come through very, very clearly in this entire discussion. How this is to be done, many, many ideas have come up also. So maybe in a more country differentiated discussion that we could do later, and we could learn about what different countries have done. I mean, this is one way that we could take this forward. Well, now during COVID, we don't have the possibility to meet each other in a meeting, but I think this webinar has been very, very interesting, lots of new ideas. Thank you to the panelists, you were wonderful. Thank you to all the very active participation. Thank you.